Hi everybody, Dan Bailey here with the second video in my Fujifilm retrospective. In this series I'm taking a look back at my 10-year journey shooting with the Fujifilm X Series cameras. In the first video, which you can find here at this link, I talk about the X10, which was my first Fujifilm camera, and why that represented such a momentous shift in my photography paradigm at the time. In this video I'm going to talk about the models that I use after the X10 that I feel represented a very important transition in my X Series life. I shot with the X10 pretty extensively for about a year and a half, shooting everything from action to portraits, to landscapes, to travel scenes, and I spent a lot of time getting to know the features that were included in this little X10 that Fuji had put in there, and also just getting used to the idea of shooting with mirrorless cameras, which were a new thing. This was actually a very interesting time in the photography industry because smartphones were quickly becoming the preferred way for people to take pictures. It's funny, I would go to the photo show in New York City once a year and I'd walk around the aisles and look at the different camera booths, and then I'd go walk around Times Square that night and I'd see 10,000 people all shooting with their iPhones, and there's not a camera in sight, not a single one, except maybe the one student using a retro Pentax on his tripod or something, doing a long exposure. But other than that, people were moving towards smartphones for photography, and the industry knew it. A few years earlier, in 2008, in a joint venture, Pentax and Olympus worked together to create the first interchangeable lens mirrorless camera. By using a live view electronic screen instead of a pentaprism, this allowed them to create a much smaller, lighter camera body that was quite a bit more compact than the traditional DSLRs at the time. The Panasonic Lumix and the Olympus PEN series were the first mirrorless cameras, and they used the Micro Four Thirds system, which used a smaller sensor than DSLRs. So with the initial success of those first mirrorless cameras, the technology was here to stay, and everybody started to jump on board. And Fujifilm made their first mirrorless camera in late 2010, and that was the original X100. So fast forward a little bit, by the end of 2012, beginning of 2013, I've been shooting with the X10 for over a year, having a ball with it, just in love with this little camera, in love with the beautiful film simulations and the high quality JPEGs that came right out of the camera. Didn't need to process, didn't need to shoot raw. It was so liberating. And then in the first quarter of 2013, Fuji announced the successor to the X10, the X20, and I ordered one as soon as they became available. I had one in my hands on April 1st. I was immediately impressed with the new updated model. It was everything I loved about the X10 and more, including a few notable improvements. Inside the X10, Fuji used what they called their EXR sensor, and this unique design offered a high level of sharpness and dynamic range despite its very small size. However, for the X20, Fuji used the X-Trans sensor, which was the same sensor they used in the X Pro 1, which was their flagship model at the time. With its random pixel array compared to a Bayer sensor, the X-Trans sensor is much less prone to an effect called moire, which is when you get these weird repeating patterns if you're shooting things like clothing and some nature scenes. And the way that most camera sensors combat that is they use an optical low-pass filter in front of the sensor. However, using that optical low-pass filter reduces sharpness and resolution in the camera. So by eliminating the need for this optical low-pass filter, the X-Trans sensor was able to create higher resolution images than a Bayer sensor of the same pixel count. And that's something that X Pro 1 shooters noticed early on. They were getting photos out of the X Pro 1 that were as sharp or even sharper than what they would see out of their Nikon and Canon DSLRs. So when I got the X20, I immediately noticed the increase in sharpness of those images over the X10 images. I was blown away by how much detail I could capture with this tiny little sensor on my X20. It was amazing. In addition, the X-Trans sensor is less susceptible to noise, especially when you're shooting at higher ISO settings on the camera. So I noticed this on the X20. With the X10, I was kind of hesitant about going up above ISO 200 or even 400, but I noticed the lack of noise that the X20 was giving me at those settings. And where there was noise, it actually looked very film-like, and this is another testament to the somewhat random array of the pixel configuration on the X-Trans sensor. It has a very film-like look, and that's exactly what they were going for. That was their mindset when they created the X-Trans sensor. So I had no problem shooting the X20 at higher ISO settings, 400, 800, even 1600, even 3200 was somewhat usable. Sure, it was noisy, but it had kind of a cool, gritty grain to it. It wasn't just this offensive noise like we'd seen in the past with most digital cameras. So the combination of increased sharpness, better noise reduction, and the wonderful looking colors on the film simulations, the images out of the X20 looked awesome. So just as I'd done with the X10, I was taking the X20 with me, shooting it side by side as a second camera along with my Nikon. And not only was it getting great images, it was holding its own alongside my durable, heavy, expensive Nikon. With its rugged metal body and its weather-sealed design, it was withstanding every bit of abuse I was throwing at it. And I wasn't the only one who was discovering just how rugged and tough these little Fujis were. I got an email one time from a woman who'd lost her camera during a hiking trip in Colorado, and it sat for 3 months out in the wild, getting rained on, snowed on, even chewed on by a bear. And she ended up finding it at the end of the season, and it was pretty beat up and even had teeth marks in it from the bear. But she brought it home, cleaned it off, recharged the battery, stuck it back in, and the camera worked just fine. Fujifilm, or rather Fujiphoto Film, as they were called back in the day, was actually a client of mine back in the early 2000s. So every once in a while I'd get a letter from them saying, please send us your best slide shot on Fujifilm to be considered for trade show prints. And they actually used a couple of mine during this time. And they would send me the actual mounted prints after the show was over. And so for a while I had this 30 by 40 print of the biker in my little apartment in Fort Collins, Colorado. And I actually still have the 24 by 36 print of the sunrise on Long's Peak. It's still with me over 20 years later. But about 6 months after I was shooting with the X10, I sent an email to one of the reps who passed me up the chain, and eventually I landed on the desk of the Fujifilm head of marketing for the electronic imaging division. So he contacted me and we started a dialogue. They were really psyched about how much I loved this little X10 and they were really pleased with the images I was getting. And so in the summer of 2012, they licensed 2 images from me to be used to help market the X10. And as I remember, there was even talk of them doing this big Costco display in all the stores around the country where they'd have my picture and my bio and a little quote or something right on the point of purchase display. But for some reason that fell through. I was kind of disappointed because I thought that would have been really cool. But either way, we continued to keep in touch and I kept sharing my images with them that I'd shot with the X10 and the X20. By early 2013, the X Series line was growing. In addition to the X20, they had just come out with a second generation of the X100, and the X Pro 1, which had been out for about a year, was making huge waves in the photo industry. An interesting thing to note, at the time, a lot of the manufacturers were trying really hard to recapture that consumer market away from smartphones, trying to get those people back to buy cameras instead of shooting with their telephone all the time. But Fujifilm decided from the very start to pursue the professional photography market. I remember reading an interview with Casey Baker, who was Fujifilm's product manager at the time. And she said that the X100 came about because in their market research, they found that a lot of pro photographers wanted a smaller, lighter camera, something they could use on their own spare time away when they weren't doing assignments, something they could take with them every day. So from the very get-go of the X Series, Fujifilm went after the pros and the enthusiasts and the people who love the craft of traditional photography. And this is why they designed the X Series with that retro style look, because they wanted something to give people who grew up with traditional cameras, who would appreciate that kind of quality and traditional craftsmanship. And it's also the reason they decided to go with the APS-C sensor instead of going micro four thirds for their cameras. APS-C is actually a film format that came from Kodak's point-and-shoot cameras, which were pretty much their last gasp trying to hold on to film before the digital revolution took over. It's a larger format than micro four thirds, so you get better image quality, but it still saves a considerable amount of size, weight, and cost compared to a full-frame camera, which uses a standard 35mm aspect ratio. And by reaching back into their long legacy and history of silver halide film, which is where the random design of the X-Trans sensor comes from, they were able to make their APS-C sensor with an increased level of resolution and noise control that rivaled and again sometimes exceeded cameras that had larger sensors. So I kept my dialogue going with Fujifilm, and in the late spring of 2013, they sent me an X-E1 to play with. So the rangefinder X-E1, which was launched in the fall of 2012, was basically a slimmed down version of the X Pro 1. Compared to the X20, it was quite a bit bigger, but the X-E1 was still lighter and smaller than my Nikon D700. So the X-E1 arrived on my doorstep right before I left for a 2-week cycling tour in Europe. I took the X-E1, the X20, and this little Nikon Coolpix point and shoot that I hardly used. I shot thousands of photos with these two Fujis. You know, the X-E1 was usually around my neck all the time. The X20 was within easy reach. Sometimes I'm shooting with both of them, all the while pedaling through small Tyrolean villages, you know, just seeing beautiful scenery all around me, and eating good food and drinking good beer as well. During the second or third day of the trip, we pedaled into the town of Fuss in Germany, which is where Neuschwanstein Castle is located. I remember riding up this steep switchback hill on the road up to the castle in the pouring rain, and then riding, you know, right underneath the entrance of the castle. I'd seen pictures of this castle my whole life. My grandmother would send me postcards of Neuschwanstein when I was a kid. And so to be able to just ride my bike right up to it was such an amazing experience. It's one of those things I'll never forget. After the Europe trip, I came back to Alaska and continued to shoot with the X-E1 all throughout the summer and fall, photographing landscapes, adventure scenes, mountain aerials, even shooting some sports with it. That said, even though the X-E1 is capable of producing beautiful high-resolution imagery, it's by no means an action camera by any sense of the word. However, I stuck with it because I loved the images I was getting from the X-E1, and I could recognize that this new mirrorless technology would very likely improve in the future. I actually enjoyed the challenge of trying to incorporate the X-E1 and the X20 into my fast-moving adventurous shooting style. It wasn't always easy because in some ways my own skills far exceeded what the camera was capable of doing. But that inspired me even more to find new ways to adapt to those limitations. My own technical experience as a photographer allowed me to find workarounds in order to capture the kinds of images that I wanted to create with these cameras. There was one time I was shooting cyclocross in the fall of 2013 using only the two Fujis, and if that wasn't challenging enough, I decided to make things even more interesting for myself. I set the X20 to shoot miniature mode only and the X-E1 to shoot in black and white, and both cameras were set to square format. It was the kind of challenge that really tested my skills as a photographer, but I ended up getting some really exciting and memorable images from that day. So my contacts at Fuji knew that I was a Nikon shooter, but sometimes during my conversations with them I'd say, you know, if you guys ever came out with like a rugged outdoor version of an X Series camera, I'd probably switch. You know, but don't tell Nikon I said that. You know, I'd had a good relationship with Nikon back then. They'd used a number of my photos for projects over the years. I wasn't actively looking to switch. I wasn't trying to be courted by anybody or anything, but I could see the writing on the wall and I could see that the X Series had real potential. When the fall of 2013, I went to Photo Plus trade show once again in New York City, and I met with the marketing guy at Fuji that I knew. He introduced me to a man named Yuji, who at the time was the liaison between the Japanese and the US marketing offices. And Yuji had seen my images and he was pretty impressed by what I was getting. And when I met him, I repeated that line, you know, if you guys ever come out with a fast autofocus weather sealed X Series camera, I'd probably switch. And he looked at me and said, well, we've got something that we think you might want to see. And that's where I'm going to end part 2, because what came next was an even more monumental shift in my photography life going forward. So I hope you're enjoying this series so far and the stories that I'm telling. Definitely stay tuned for next episode. In the meantime, please subscribe to my channel. Again, please leave a comment. Feel free to tell me even more stories and anecdotes about your own X Series life and history. If you are a Fuji shooter, you'll definitely want to check out my best-selling ebook, X Series Unlimited. This is a 400-page guidebook that'll teach you everything you need to know in order to get the best performance and have the most fun with your Fuji camera. It's basically the missing manual to the X Series. You can find me on Patreon and social media at Dan Bailey Photo, and you can visit my website and blog as well. So thanks again for watching. Have fun with your Fuji, and I'll see you next time.